I'm Mike Fouché. I'm one of the reporters from Grown In, and we have got a terrific webinar today on the state of banking and cannabis. Before I get started, I want to thank our four sponsors today. First, Green Spoon Martyr. The team at Green Spoon Martyr understands the unique challenges facing the cannabis industry. With full service capabilities and over 20 offices in the US, our attorneys help every kind of plant touching company, as well as ancillary businesses and investors around the country. And also Englewood Construction, with national experience with high-end retail and secure industrial facilities. Englewood Construction is a critical choice for cannabis facility construction. Our stable of diverse and equitable partners lets Englewood Construction create your vision anywhere in the United States. Green Rose Advisors. Have a new cannabis license and need help with your next steps? Green Rose Advisors team stands ready to help you maximize your cannabis opportunity. And finally, Forest Security. Starting a new cannabis business is tough, but meeting specialized security requirements is even tougher. Let Forest Security handle all your security needs so you can concentrate on the things most important to you. All right, and with that, I want to get started talking about the state of banking for the cannabis industry, and we have two fantastic panelists today. Stacy Litke is Director of Banking Compliance at GreenCheck Verified with decades of experience in the financial services industry. Prior to joining GreenCheck, Stacy was Senior Vice President of Operations for a Massachusetts-based $900 million institution. Today, she uses her collective experience to help financial institutions with compliant cannabis banking programs. And Carly Berard, she serves as Senior Counsel for the Illinois Bankers Association. She joined the IBA's Law Department in 2018, where she's researched numerous bank compliance questions, moderated bank regulatory panels, and assisted with internal legal matters. Before joining the IBA, Carly spent 12 years in private practice at a small law firm, where she represented banks in commercial and residential mortgage foreclosures and workouts, municipal proceedings, and bankruptcy matters. Thank you both very much for being here today. Really appreciate you taking time to do this. And I'm going to get started right off the bat with a question for Carly, and Stacy, jump in too if you want to. But Carly, what is your expectation for action by Congress in the next year or three on banking and cannabis?
Well, my short answer is I think our best hope for something happening will be in 2022. And 3 years from now, or in 2023, I think if something hasn't happened by then, we could be looking at an uphill battle if we see a shift in the balance of the Senate. So I think next year might be our best hope for getting something done. And I want to talk about two pieces of legislation. The first is the Safe Banking Act, also known as the Secure and Fair Enforcement Banking Act. This was originally introduced by Representative Ed Perlmutter, a Democrat from Colorado, in 2019 to allow financial institutions to provide services to cannabis businesses without fear of federal penalties. So it would create a limited safe harbor for banks and other depository institutions serving cannabis businesses that are compliant with state law. That law would also prohibit federal regulators from penalizing banks, from removing their deposit insurance, or otherwise discouraging them from providing banking services to state legal cannabis businesses. The Safe Banking Act would not remove cannabis from the Schedule I of the Controlled Substances Act, but it would amend the federal criminal code's prohibitions on money laundering and monetary transactions involving criminal proceeds and all other provisions of federal law to provide an exemption for the proceeds from transactions of legitimate cannabis businesses. So that original bill passed the House 321 to 103 in September of 2019 with broad bipartisan support. However, it died in the Senate because Majority Leader Mitch McConnell chose not to introduce it on the Senate floor. So then we have a change in administration, and the Safe Banking Act was reintroduced in the 117th Congress as HR 1996. And on April 20th of this year, it passed the House with a vote of 321 to 101, and that included 106 Republicans. So again, broad bipartisan support for that, and it's now in the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. And I think there was an early expectation that with the change in administration, this bill would be a slam dunk. Unfortunately, it hasn't played out that way, since there has been a big push from Senate Democrats to enact comprehensive cannabis reform before they enact a bill that's narrowly tailored to the banking industry. And so that brings us to some proposed legislation, the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act. On July 14th, Senators Chuck Schumer, Cory Booker, and Ron Wyden released draft legislation that would decriminalize cannabis at the federal level. This bill is very far-reaching. It would do a lot of things. First and foremost, it would remove cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act and transfer primary jurisdiction over cannabis from the DEA to the FDA, the TTB, which is the Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, and the ATF. And then those agencies would have responsibilities for cannabis similar to alcohol and tobacco. The bill would recognize state law as controlling the possession, production, and distribution of cannabis, but it would retain federal criminal penalties for cannabis diversion, defined as the unlawful possession, production, or distribution of or purchase of 10 pounds or more of cannabis in violation of federal or state law. Under this legislation, states would be able to prohibit cannabis possession, production, and distribution within their state, but they would not be able to prohibit interstate commerce of cannabis being transported through its borders for lawful delivery into another state. There are also provisions mandating. Oh, sure.
Can I interrupt you for a second, Carly? So just to be clear here for a minute, though, the Safe Banking Act is waylaid because there's no action being taken in the Senate. And this new proposal from Schumer and others, CLOA, right? Cannabis Legalization, that isn't going anywhere either, because it basically has the same problem as the Safe Banking Act, right? There's a certain number of senators. There's enough senators that don't want to have any kind of change. Is that accurate?
Yes, I think that's accurate. I think the sponsors of the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act know that they don't have 60 votes for this legislation the way it's been drafted. It has only been issued as draft legislation with a comment period that ends on September 1. So they want to get comments, public comments in from other lawmakers, industry stakeholders, and to see, what might be palatable, what might be something that they can get passed. They know, they can't have everything they want, but maybe there are some elements that potentially could have bipartisan support. Unfortunately for the Safe Banking Act, there's this push among certain Democrats to address social issues first regarding cannabis. And I know during a press conference introducing the draft legislation, Cory Booker said he would lay himself down to block the Safe Banking Act if comprehensive reform isn't approved first. He later walked back that statement a little bit. He clarified his comments to say that that the Safe Banking Act is a necessary sweetener to get people to move along on the equitable justice elements that are really critical. So, after they get their comments in and they consider, what actually will be enactable, maybe we'll see something closer to a combination of Safe Banking Act and maybe some of the provisions of what is in their draft legislation.
So meanwhile, there's all this other stuff that's going on in Congress too, right? You have the infrastructure bill, you have a budget that they want to pass, and immigration is raging, and the immigration issues. And then there's also COVID, so there's a stack of things that are in front of cannabis, maybe that Congress is addressing. Is that accurate?
I do think that's accurate. I don't think cannabis is necessarily on the front burner for anyone right now. I was on a call with the American Bankers Association's Cannabis Coalition earlier this month. And in their opinion, they didn't think that we'd see a revised draft of this legalization legislation until next spring. But then the Afghanistan withdrawal happened, and President Biden's under a lot of fire. And maybe there's a very real chance that Republicans will take back the Senate in the next congressional election. So I don't know if that will light a fire under Democrats to maybe try to, push something through that they think could actually get passed. That might change things.
So if we were going to have some sort of an odds making operation, we'd say that it's pretty low odds that there's something that's going to happen in the next 18 months. Does that sound about right to you?
I think it is fairly low, unless the progressive Democrats who are pushing the restorative justice issues, unless they're willing to, let that go and, let Safe Banking Act go forward, which I think has a much better chance of actually making it in the Senate, then probably we won't see, much progress there.
Okay, so with that, thank you very much, Carly. And I wanted to ask you about that and set that bar, because there's a lot of conversation about, well, Congress is going to do something. And then once Congress does something, then everything's going to change and the world's going to be better and there's going to be butterflies and rainbows all over the place. So now we know the hard truth, which is it doesn't seem like there's a lot of likelihood of something happening anytime soon. So we're back to what happens in the States. And so, Stacy, I want to ask you, as somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about regulation and compliance all over the country, is there anything that states can be doing to improve banking for cannabis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when with working with our financial institutions, there's a couple of different things that we could see at the state level that would certainly help financial institutions be more comfortable in banking. One of which is the state level banking associations, Division of Financial Services. If they're engaged and educated on how cannabis banking works and how they can support their institutions to build programs, compliant programs, that is certainly a help. But also at the level of the cannabis authority, right? Whether it's a control commission or under pharmacy or however the program's developed, if the cannabis agencies would provide some transparency around their programs and their licensing, that makes the process much smoother for the financial institution and the cannabis business to exchange information and show validity of license, background check, inspections, that sort of thing, when licenses are revoked. A great example, Oklahoma, for all its craziness, the OMMA is very transparent and you can get a lot of information. So the banks and the cannabis businesses are able to leverage that to share information and show transparency. So
hold on a minute, if I'll just interrupt.
Yep.
When you say transparency, you mean things like the state publicly lists who owns licenses, who are the owners of licenses, and so a lot of states don't have that. Michigan, for instance, does. Illinois does not. Missouri does not. It's a problem for financial institutions. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, and you broke up a little bit, but I think I get the gist of the question. Is that in this industry, between these two in these two sets of industries, the transparency between the two is critical, and having that third party in the middle that is sharing information in both directions is super important.
Okay, and I understand that my internet connection is not great. I don't know how many. Somebody else made a comment to me on that. And before I go much further, I want to say, if you have any questions, please put them down in the chat. and I'll be watching them, and we'll be asking questions from the audience in a little bit. So, Stacy, you think that it is possible for states to do things. Carly, boy, am I really breaking up bad? This is.
You're okay right now.
Yeah, you're okay now.
Okay. Carly, I understand Illinois has had some problems getting financial institutions to bank cannabis. Is that still the case? And are there steps that they were able to take in order to make it easier or better for banks?
Well, I guess there's a limit to what I think a state can do to make banking easier. Just because as long as cannabis remains illegal under the Federal Controlled Substances Act, its use is prohibited for any purpose. So for banks, that means all the proceeds generated by a cannabis business operating in compliance with state law are still federally unlawful, and any financial transactions with those proceeds, even including accepting deposits, is still considered money laundering. And all banks, whether federally or state chartered, are subject to federal anti-money laundering laws. Now, as far as what a state can do, the state banking regulator can provide clear guidance to banks on, what they're looking for in examinations, exactly what level of due diligence and monitoring they expect to see. But, there are real risks involved with a bank deciding to bank these customers. And I think that's why we don't see, a lot of banks wanting to get into this space.
Mm-hmm. So, thank you very much. I want to switch gears a little bit here, and I want to ask you both the question, if so in this environment, and it's difficult to figure out how to find a good place to do business with, if you're a cannabis company, I want to ask both of you, what is it that a cannabis business should be looking for when they're trying to evaluate a financial institution to bank cannabis? Stacy, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, this one's important. My first recommendation would be in finding a cannabis friendly institution that will work directly with you. If you have that option, take that option. There are a number of third parties and interesting options to work around the financial system, and I truly feel that the best and most stable relationship is going to be directly with a financial institution who has, raised their hand and said, we're cannabis friendly. Beyond that, when you're shopping between institutions, if you have that option where you can look at 2 or 3 and see what they have to offer, don't just stop at the price, right? We have a number of low priced providers in the markets that we're in. And, they'll come to the table and say, hey, we have the cheapest price in town. And that's great. Maybe it's $250 a month for a banking account. And that's really good compared to the guy down the street that charges $1,500. But peel the layers back. I just had a conversation with an institution who was one of those low price providers. And through the conversation, I found out that they charge $2,500 for a wire, which is crazy, right? So if I'm with someone who's $1,000 a month, but I only charge $25 for a wire, take a look at what those differences are. What is all of the pricing, not just that surface pricing? What are they offering? Are they offering you a place to park cash and they're not going to really let you do much else? Or are they treating you like a small business, any other small business within their portfolio? Are they going to allow you to do payroll transactions and ACH and pay your vendors and do wires and that sort of thing? So look at the full relationship. I would also add that, there, and I know we're going to touch on this potentially in another question, but there's some institutions that are starting to lend, and most of those lending relationships will require you to have a deposit relationship as well. So if you can build a relationship with an institution that's already thinking about lending, when the time comes that they're ready or you're ready, you already have that connection and you've built up that relationship and they have transparency into your operations.
Carly, do you have anything to add to that? What are some things people should be looking for?
I would think generally they should look for a financial institution where their business is located, and if possible, one that has banked other cannabis businesses in the past. I think if you're the first cannabis business that an institution decides to do business with, they might determine that the heightened due diligence, monitoring, and reporting just isn't worth it. I know from speaking to regulators that there are some banks that have gotten involved in this space and then decided to pull back because they realized, just from a business point of view, it just wasn't worth it for them to have, you know, the extra work, the extra due diligence and compliance that goes into trying to mitigate the risk of these customers.
And actually, I want to follow up on that, because one of the things that I've noticed is that there are a lot of financial institutions that are banking for companies that are in other states, and maybe not necessarily next door, but a few states away. So, you know, Carly, how, in your experience, how much does that matter? And, you know, is that, what kind of risk does that add for a customer?
Well, I think it could be hard to find a bank that's willing to bank an out-of-state cannabis customer. One, because their employees may be less familiar with another state's laws related to cannabis. And also because the 2014 FinCEN guidance on Bank Security Act expectations regarding marijuana businesses lists certain red flags to distinguish whether a bank should file a marijuana priority suspicious activity report as opposed to a limited SAR. We can talk about what those are in more detail. And one of the red flags is that the cannabis business engages in international or interstate activity, including by receiving cash deposits from locations outside the state in which the business operates, making or recording frequent or large interstate transfers, or otherwise transacting with persons or entities located in different states or countries. So for that reason, you know, a bank might see it as a red flag if a company is out of state, and they might, you know, not want to deal with them.
So, okay, explain FinCEN for a second. What is FinCEN?
FinCEN is a regulatory body that has provided guidance to banks on dealing with state legal cannabis businesses. So the Bank Security Act is a statute that banks have to follow, and it requires them to file suspicious activity reports if they suspect
that's SARS, right?
Yeah, if they expect some type of illegal activity aggregating related to transactions aggregating $5,000 or more. And there is an ongoing duty to file SARS every 90 days. So if a bank decides, I'm going to take on this customer who, let's say, is a cannabis dispensary, so you're looking at all the money that comes in, and, you know, every $5,000 you're filing a suspicious activity report. And that 2014 FinCEN guidance lists FinCEN's expectations for banks regarding marijuana businesses. And so there's like 3 levels of SAR to file for a marijuana related business. There's a marijuana limited SAR, and that is appropriate to file when a bank reasonably believes, based on its customer due diligence, that doing business with this particular business does not implicate one of the Cole Memo priorities. The Cole Memo is a 2013 memo from Deputy Attorney General James Cole to U.S. attorneys that set expectations regarding how to address states that had implemented legal adult cannabis. Oops.
We lost you.
Yeah. Can you still hear me?
We can still hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. So it listed priorities of what, you know, prosecutors should be looking for, and if these priorities aren't implicated, then maybe they're not going to go after, you know, companies dealing in this space. So some of those priorities are preventing distribution to minors, preventing cannabis revenue from funding criminal enterprises, gangs, or cartels, preventing cannabis from moving out of states where it's legal, preventing the use of state legal cannabis sales as a cover for illegal activity, preventing violence in the use of firearms in growing or distributing cannabis, preventing driving under the influence of cannabis, preventing growing cannabis on public lands, and preventing cannabis possession or use on federal property. So if you are a state legal cannabis business and
Carly,
you're not involved with those things, then you're a low priority to prosecute. So
we've got a lot of layers of the onion here
Yeah.
in terms of the rules, and that makes a lot of sense. And it's very complicated, and we know that all these layers add up to where we are. But the long and the short of it is, it sounds to me that you're suggesting, well, if you're going to bank with somebody that's out of state, that bank is taking a bigger risk on you, and you're taking a bigger risk on them for their ability to follow up with compliance. Stacy, you were nodding your head before. How does that fit in with the compliance work that you're doing with banks?
Well, I actually have a little bit different perspective than Carly. We have institutions that are banking outside of their state, right? So they're larger regional institutions. They have a broader reach, and they may have a physical location in one state, but they will bank MRBs in another. The way that they manage that is that you have to make sure that the marijuana business is following the rules of their state, not the state that the bank is located in. So making sure that the transaction activity that's coming in is following the rules of the MRB state. They use couriers to pick up the cash, deliver it directly to the Fed on behalf of them. They don't need to have a branch presence. And as long as the product is not crossing state lines, there's not specific guidance that says the money can't cross state lines. Carly brings up a great perspective about out-of-state owners. That is something you have to understand and look for. But that's out of state to the state of the MRB. So if all of the MRB owners are within one state and they're all following the rules of their state, the fact that their financial institution is in another state isn't necessarily prohibitive. But of course, your preference on your banking relationship depends on your business. If you want the banker down the street that you can go in and have a conversation with, that plays into this decision as well. But if your only option is someone who's out of state and you can find a cannabis friendly bank that's larger and regional that offers that, there's no reason you can't take advantage of it.
And just to make this point, MRB is banker speak for marijuana related business, right?
Yes.
And,
you got
and
it.
that's a term that's used pretty often among banks. And so, that goes into a question, Stacy, I want to ask you, what exactly does a financial institution want to know and report to regulators about a cannabis business?
Well, their primary obligation, going back to what Carly was talking about with FinCEN, is to make sure that the cannabis business is bringing in dollars from legitimate legal state sales, right? So that's you want to let the good money in, keep the bad money out. Anything that's not legal under the state should not be banked. You also have to make sure that, as Carly mentioned, that the Cole memo priorities are not violated. So there's a lot of due diligence that goes into approving an account up front, right? So we need to look at, are they licensed under the state? Are they licensed as a business? Are they in good standing as a business? What does their financial picture look like? And that's tax returns, that's balance sheet. We're also looking at insurance, lease agreements, employee manuals, right? Going back to those Cole memo priorities, how do we know that they are not selling to minors? Well, what other than sitting in the parking lot and making sure that that doesn't happen? One of the ways in which a bank can do that is to look at the employee training manuals to show that employees are trained and directed not to do that. We're also looking at approved vendor lists, so we know who you normally do business with, what your normal activity is, and when the relationship is established, the information that needs to be exchanged is around the sales and the deposits, right? Because we want to make sure that every deposit can be traced back to a state legal sale. And in that way, we can show our examiners that we're not, well, this is where it gets complicated, right? Around the term money laundering, because technically you are, but you're not. Is if you can show that at the very least, to Carly's point about low level of prosecution, if you can say to the examiner and the regulators, these dollars are from legal sales, you're good.
There's the dog, Stacy. Uh, um, so okay, that's good to know. And so there's all of this compliance stuff that's necessary. And so one of the things that I have heard is that banks are reluctant to lend money or to have credit lines or anything to do with debt with cannabis businesses. Um, Carly, are we seeing banks and financial institutions lending to cannabis businesses now?
You know, that's not something that I've really seen. And, you know, Stacy may have a different perspective on that. I think that without the federal decriminalization of cannabis, it's going to be very challenging to find a bank willing to lend to a cannabis business just because of the difficulty of collateralizing these loans. And, you know, maybe the unlikelihood that a bank would want to make an unsecured loan to a cannabis business. Um, you know, I think it's unlikely a bank would be willing to extend a loan secured by collateral that it would be illegal for the bank to take possession of in the event of a default. I don't think a bank would want to make, you know, an inventory loan secured by cannabis, since, you know, the bank can't take possession of that. Nor would they want a mortgage secured by a dispensary or land where cannabis crops are grown. There's a federal statute known as the crack house statute. It's 21 USC 856, which forbids mortgagees from profiting from a property that it manages or controls that is used for the purpose of distributing a controlled substance. So if you extend a mortgage loan to a commercial real estate owner who then, you know, rents out a space to a dispensary, and they sign, you know, an assignment of leases and rents, well, a bank can't accept those rents if they're from, you know, a federally illegal business under the statute. So those are some real roadblocks, I think, to lending in this space.
Stacy, what are you seeing?
Yeah, there's definitely additional risk around collateral. Carly made some really great points there, particularly for institutions that are generally comfortable with, you know, inventory as collateral. We know it can't be foreclosed on. Licenses, though, in some states are now available as collateral. Not in all states, but that's something that can be collateralized. There's some additional challenges around not only collateralization, but also bankruptcy laws, right? Because we know that cannabis businesses at the federal level cannot take advantage of bankruptcy laws. So if there was a bankruptcy event, there's no receiver to distribute assets. So institutions that are starting to brave these waters a little bit are thinking about, well, how can we appoint a receiver, or how can we become the receiver in order to make sure that that particular situation is covered. Um, we've seen more and more institutions asking questions like, how do I do this? What are my options? We talk about cross collateralization. We talk about using things like, you know, owners' private residences, personal guarantees, um, or dipping their toes into this water by saying, let's do a small $25,000, $50,000 unsecured line of credit. You have ultimate transparency into the cannabis business that you're working with. You look at their sales activity, you see their ebbs and flows, you've seen their financials, you know whether or not you're comfortable giving them a small line of credit to help them, particularly as a grower, help them through a season and get them prepared. So we are seeing it. They see the opportunity, right? They're hearing the stories that I'm hearing, that the cannabis industry is paying crazy rates. I've heard as high as 60% on capital loans, and that's just crazy. So if a financial institution can come in and take out one of those loans at 10 or 15%, that is a far more palatable rate for the industry. It's a win for the financial institution because that's, you know, 10% higher than what they're getting for every other small business. So they're covering their risk. We talk about planning for loan loss reserves and things like that. So it is something that is becoming more and more part of the conversation. And we do have a couple institutions, at least within our client base, that are beginning to lend. Although very cautiously, right? Because as Carly pointed out, there's a number of challenges that need to be overcome around that.
So I want to ask the question, mostly what I've learned about and cannabis businesses I've spoken to, the way that they learned about a bank or word of mouth. Is there how can cannabis businesses find financial institutions to bank for?
At the sake of being self-serving, call me, right? We
Okay.
have a number of financial institutions that that use our software and are cannabis friendly. So we're always happy to make the connection. But beyond that, look at some of your local cannabis trade associations. We always encourage our financial institutions to maybe advertise there or be a part of a listing, participate in events. Cannabis conferences and shows. As a matter of fact, next week I'll be in Vegas with one of our clients, and they're going to be there looking for MSOs. You can also, go to Google, right? I have Google alerts set up for cannabis banking, and I'm always getting articles of, those institutions that are brave enough to go public. They like to toot their own horn and say, hey, we're doing cannabis banking. So you can find some of them just through Google search. But, again, just be careful that as you're out there searching for cannabis banking, that you understand the relationship and what you're getting into, because there are some sketchy players and hobbyists out there that are circumventing the financial system and could end up, a little bit of heartache having to close accounts and switch things around. But they are out there. We can help you find them.
Carly, do you have any advice?
Yeah, I have one other suggestion. Just because there are banks who are in this space, but they don't want to advertise it, just because there's reputational risk involved, or they think it might not sit well with their customer base. And that is to go through an intermediary, such as a state banking association, or maybe a law firm that represents a lot of banks, and go to them and say, I'm looking for a bank who will do this type of business. And then that intermediary can go to the bank and ask them, do you want to take on a new customer? Are you interested in doing this business? If the answer is yes, then they'll contact the cannabis business. As sort of a, don't call us, we'll call you type of situation.
That's a great suggestion, Carly. And I would add to that list accountants and the Cannabis Control Commission in your state and cannabis consultants. Like, they all have a pulse on who does and who doesn't do banking. So that's a great point.
So there's a couple of folks who had a question about 280E. Carly, can you clarify, does the Safe Banking Act, would that eliminate the 280E rule for cannabis businesses?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with 280E.
280E, go ahead, Stacy.
Yeah, I can take this one. The 280E is the inability for cannabis businesses to deduct expenses under IRS law. No, safe banking does not eliminate that. Safe banking only says, at a high level, and Carly did a much better job explaining it all, but it's basically that they won't go after the banks, right? It doesn't change the Controlled Substance Act. It doesn't change the IRS rules. It just simply says, we won't go after banks. What would change that? Yeah, right. It gives the banks and financial institutions a greater sense of comfort that they can enter the industry. It puts into law what is happening in practice today, that they're not running around shutting down these institutions. But the second act that Carly spoke to, the CAOA, that would declassify cannabis as a controlled substance, and that would likely run downstream to 280E and make changes there, because it would no longer be an illegal substance, and therefore they couldn't use 280E against the business.
So last thing I want to ask is, if I'm a cannabis business, what are the things that I can be doing to make myself more attractive as a customer? Stacy, can you start with that?
Sure. You broke up a little bit, but I think I got the gist here. The first thing to do is make sure that you're dealing with a cannabis friendly bank, because if you're trying to establish a relationship with a institution who does not want to bank cannabis, you can tap dance all day long. You are never going to be attractive to them because their policy says we don't bank cannabis. So, the first step is to make sure that who you're dealing with is a cannabis friendly bank. But beyond that, it's all about transparency, right? Make sure that when they ask you for this list of stuff, that you provide them all of the stuff. Uh, they're using that as a litmus test to make sure that if you are transparent, upfront, and clear about your business from the very beginning, they're going to build more trust with you. If you're not willing to provide your tax returns, or they're not ready, or you don't have an employee manual, that's going to start to look like avoidance, right? And if you're avoiding that at the interview or the application process, you're going to be challenging as we're looking for sales information and clarification on certain transactions down the road. So transparency is key. I would also suggest that invite them to come see your facility, right? A lot of the financial institutions that I deal with have this perception of what cannabis is. They are not familiar with the cannabis industry, as many of them are conservative, risk-based folks. They just don't know what that looks like, and they have this image of what a cannabis business is based on Cheech and Chong, right? They just don't understand that these are legitimate, professional, well-run businesses that look like spas and doctors' offices. It's not a blacklight poster and beads on the wall like what they're thinking in their head. Show them how professional you are. Show them how you run your business, and that you are a good partner in your community.
I like the blacklight poster and beads on the wall. That's a great
Maybe
image.
dating myself with that one.
No, you're not. So Carly, do you have anything to add to that?
I do. Number one, make sure you're in compliance with state laws, regulations, and guidance related to operating a legal cannabis business in your state. Two, review that FinCEN guidance from 2014 to financial institutions to make sure that your business doesn't implicate any of those red flags that are listed. And then there's another resource I want to let people know about. It is the FDIC's FinTech guidance from February 2020, and it's called Conducting Business with Banks, a Guide for FinTechs and Third Parties. Now, this isn't directed at cannabis businesses, but a cannabis business that follows this guidance, I think, would make themselves a much more attractive candidate. This guidance lays out what a bank will review when determining whether to do business with a fintech or another third party, such as assessing its financial condition, its compliance with local laws, its ownership and management structure, its risk management and controls. It answers the question, what should I do if I want to provide a service to or partner with a bank? And these things include understanding the framework of laws and regulations that apply to the bank, maintaining a well-managed and financially strong business, demonstrating the business has appropriate monitoring systems in place. And then it also lists the type of information a bank will likely want to see, and that includes background and ownership information, your internal policies, procedures, and infrastructure, your financial information, your marketing materials. Information a bank may want to see also would include ongoing things like licensing, registrations, financial statements, insurance coverage, audits. So, all of that guidance I think is relevant to a cannabis business, to give a bank, some reassurances that you're going to be, you're managing your risks as much as possible, and therefore you're a lower risk for the bank to take on.
So one more time, Carly, what's the name of that document?
It's Conducting Business with Banks, a Guide for FinTechs and Third Parties.
And that's
I can send you a list of links for any of the resources I've mentioned.
That would be great. And that's part of, that's from the FDIC.
Yes, that's FDIC.
Okay. I want to thank you both very much. We're at the end of our time. And it's been terrific to have you both. You're both very clearly experts in this industry. and have a lot of knowledge to share. And thank you for the time today. I want to thank Stacy Litke from Green Check Verified and Carly Berard from the Illinois Bankers Association, and also our 4 sponsors today: Green Spoon Martyr, Inglewood Construction, Green Rose Advisors, and Forest Security.